Chair recognizes Senator from Rustic, Senator Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. President. That might be a sign that this side is more busy than the other. I don't know. And I do have a great litigator seated directly behind me who I expect will be speaking shortly on this measure. The beauty of going second is that you get to figure out what you got to address after the fact. So I might rise a second time on this, depending on how well he does. LD 249, in addition to being in front of the committee that I serve on, is also a bill that I sponsored. And the language of the bill is quite simple in that it would repeal the current policy, which is known as net energy billing, whereby developers would be of renewable projects, what we're mostly talking about is solar projects, would be able to receive a benefit for projects up to 5 megawatts that would be attached to the grid. Unfortunately, that program is quite expensive, and what we've seen play out over the years, in the last 2 years since the program was enacted in the 129th, and to be clear, I opposed it. I wasn't in the chamber here, but I did oppose that bill then when I was serving in the other body, because of the fact that we knew it would increase costs. We didn't know how much, we didn't know what the actual impact was going to be, but at the end of the day, the ratepayer would suffer. And these are folks that you and I represent, Mr. President, up in the county and around the state. Many of them are on fixed incomes, so any sort of cost increase is a big problem for them. It means choices between going out and purchasing a prescription that they might need or being able to afford groceries for the week. And so I think that we have a role within this body, within the legislature generally, to look out for those folks and to be enacting policies with them in mind. Because those are the folks who sent us here to have their back and candidly believe in us that we're going to be doing the right thing on their behalf. That's why they sent us here. This policy, unfortunately, has resulted in substantial investments, in large part from outside of the state, from investors who see this policy as incredibly financially lucrative. In the words of one individual who spoke at the public hearing in front of a committee, they aren't coming here for the lobster. They're coming here because they can receive a significant financial benefit from the policy which we enacted 2 years ago and which literally boomed as soon as it became law. Why is that? Well, the thing is, we can get cheap land in the state of Maine relative to some other parts of the state, so they buy it up. And it's not necessarily in a particularly convenient spot to attach to the grid, which that requires substantial investment in and of itself to make those improvements to our old infrastructure, which was designed to have power flowing really one way, from a generator to a consumer, not sporadically with hundreds of different locations of generation all around the grid with just a limited amount of connection points, and suddenly electrons are going everywhere. So in order to address that, we have to upgrade the grid. Well, that's a cost to the ratepayer. Then beyond that, the actual rate at which they can receive per kilowatt hour is substantially higher than what you would see in other more economically scaled projects that would be like grid scale. Those projects, anywhere between 4 or 5 cents per kilowatt hour. These projects are over 15 cents. Talking the same technology, but you don't have the economies of scale. So that results in another impact to the ratepayer. Recent reports, there was a reporting mechanism that was built in to the underlying legislation which enacted this boom that said after 10 months or 3 years, 10% of peak load being hit by these projects, or 3 years, whichever one came first, there would be a mandatory report back. Well, we hit that in about 6 months. It's about a half a year. The reason why is because there's this explosion of folks that saw a way to make money off of Maine people. They're not getting the benefit. They're getting a higher bill. Now, that's problematic for a lot of folks, I'm sure, but it should be, Mr. President, this is an opportunity to right the ship. This is an opportunity, one of those few opportunities we have to really chart a course forward that puts the people first and is going to substantially limit their financial exposure. Based on the results in committee, I don't think that's going to happen. It's unfortunate. But there's been this long saga and this long process that we've used in EUT to try to come up with some sort of deal. But at the end of the day, the question turns on how hard do you want to hit the ratepayer? Because if we vote no here, we're going to hit them to the tune of $160 million every year. There's other proposals, I hit them for less, maybe half. But the real question is, should we hit them for any? Or should we have their backs? Should we not raise rates on them unnecessarily so that folks from away can get rich on them? And that, rest assured, that is exactly what is happening. Mr. President, I would request that you and all of my colleagues here today follow me in voting down this motion so that we can pass this bill and we can get back to work in the EUT committee crafting sensible policy that isn't going to be crippling our constituents as ratepayers. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the Senator from York, Senator Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I rise to address the remarks by my good friend from Aroostook, who's very well-intentioned, but unfortunately is mistaken on a few points on the net energy billing program, which I hope to correct. First and foremost, I would say why net energy billing has been such a great success and so desired in the state of Maine is because we went through 8 years when this state of Maine, through the executive branch, discouraged investment in solar energy as a renewable. And when we opened up that option, and I might say that that option for solar generation was opened up in a bipartisan manner, originating in this body with the Republican leader in the Senate at the time, when that was opened up, there was a huge unmet demand and desire to bring solar energy into Maine. And that's what led to so many solar projects being promoted or thought of in the state of Maine. It wasn't the low cost of land or anything like that. This idea of repealing it is bad for very specific reasons. One, it's bad for business and it's bad for the Maine economy. Many, many businesses have invested a lot of money in producing this renewable energy in Maine. To do what the good senator from Aroostook intends means those investments will be lost. That money will go down the tubes and Maine's economy will suffer. It's also, bad for the grid in Maine, because what the good senator from Aroostook fails to mention is that distributive generation, solar energy, actually improves the grid structure by encouraging investment in the distribution portion of the grid and enhancing that portion. And we need to invest in our grid, both in transmission and distribution. It's a bad idea for a third reason, because if we continue down this path of burn, 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 burn oil, burn coal, and do not move to renewables, it is bad for our environment and it is bad for climate change. The fourth point I would make is that this is essentially, this bill, were it to pass, is bad for ratepayers, both residential and commercial ratepayers. And the reason why is there's a big bill down the road to be paid if we continue on this path of consuming carbon as a basis for producing electricity. There's a limited amount of carbon on Earth, and as it is depleted, the cost of carbon goes up. And the ratepayers will ultimately have to pay higher and higher rates to produce electricity by carbon unless we start to convert to more renewables now. It's also bad in the short term because there are many ratepayers and many consumers out there who have entered into these net energy billing agreements, and they are actually getting electricity cheaper under those agreements than they would if they just bought it without an agreement. It's bad both in the short term and the long term for consumers, to repeal this program, and I ask you to reject reject this bill and support the ought not pass committee report.
Chair recognizes the senator from Aroostook, Senator Stewart.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I did give this chamber fair warning. I might rise one more time. And I do that to address a few of the comments made by my good friend from York County. The first is that these upgrades being done to the grid, realistically, should be done by the utilities. They should be done in accordance with their strategic planning that they have financially accounted for in the long term, and not sporadically as these projects pop up throughout the grid without any sort of rhyme or reason, in large part based on where is the land the cheapest. That was my comment with regard to land prices. The second is a question about the environment, the environmental impacts and whatnot that were raised by the senator from York. Point well taken, that we should be cognizant of the fact that there are better sources of energy from the environment. But this cuts off our nose to spite our face, because what we're actually doing, the big irony here, is that we're going to be increasing electric rates at the same time that we're trying to push folks towards things like beneficial electrification, including things like EVs. If it's more expensive to charge your EV because the rates went up, you're going to be less inclined to buy one because it's suddenly no longer economically feasible compared to a fossil-fueled vehicle. I'd say, too, that there's plenty of cheaper options for electricity that are also beneficial to the environment. Hydro is a great example. I'd wager even nuclear, that have minimal impacts on the environment, and yet we're not paying them 15 cents a kilowatt hour. We're just paying this small subset, who once again are from out of state and from away. You know, at the end of the day, it really boils down to this. Who do we prioritize? All of those things that were brought up were good points, that we should care about the environment, and there's cheaper ways to do that are more effective. That we should find ways to incentivize beneficial electrification, which this current program and what this bill seeks to do to address will actually hurt in the long run. But at the end of the day, it boils down to, do we care enough about the impact to the ratepayer? Or are we saying solar no matter what costs, net energy billing no matter what costs, distributed generation no matter what cost? It doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and it shouldn't make a lot of sense to the folks in this room. I'm not arguing the merits and why that measure was put forward. I understand that, and I agree with a lot of those points. But what I don't agree with is what we're doing to the ratepayers and to our constituents. Thank you, Mr. President.